and she freed dozens and dozens of human beings from slavery. And she would usually lead these missions on Saturday nights because she knew that newspapers wouldn't publish runaway slave notices until Mondays, and so that gave her an extra day. She sang spiritual songs, like, Christian songs, and she would change the lyrics. She basically used code with the lyrics of the songs. She would change them to kind of give people a heads up, like, hey, the coast is clear, or hey, you might want to lay low for a second. During the Civil War, when the Civil War broke out, she's like, I have to serve. And she served as a recruiter and a nurse, but she also served as a spy, providing the Union with critical information about the geography and other things the Union would find useful. She became the first woman to lead an assault during the Civil War. She actually directed a naval assault that liberated 750 slaves. She's amazing. Later in her life, it wasn't that much later, I think it was like 1869, after the war, she had basically a notice from the government that made it okay for her to ride on a particular train. And the conductor, offended that an African-American woman was on the train, asked her to move to a different section, and she said no. He tried to physically move her. She grabbed on for dear life. He broke her arm, and eventually they threw her in the baggage car. This anticipates Rosa Parks by 90 years. And just as a coda to this story, in 2016, the Obama administration directed the Treasury Department to put Harriet Tubman's picture on the front of the $20 bill, move Andrew Jackson, who's currently on there, to the back of the $20 bill. And that was supposed to take effect in 2021, I believe. But the Trump administration, it was within the first year of President Trump taking office, basically told the Treasury Department to stop that process. So I honestly don't know what's going to happen with that. I think for the foreseeable future, it's going to be Andrew Jackson on the 20, a slave owner, and not Harriet Tubman on the 20, a slave who escaped for freedom and helped dozens, if not hundreds of people get their own freedom. So that's Harriet Tubman's story. Another remarkable woman, another unbelievably brave, courageous, giving, exceptional human being in the Civil War was a woman named Clara Barton. She worked a variety of jobs. She was a teacher. She was a writer. She actually opened a school. She worked in the U.S. Patent Office for a while and was the first woman to have such a high-profile government job. But when the Civil War broke out, now she wasn't trained to be a nurse. She taught herself. And the second the Civil War broke out, there are some people that they're just born to serve. They're just born to help. And she was a helper, the ultimate helper, maybe the greatest helper in the history of the United States of America. And she would go to the battlefield. She was called the Angel of the Battlefield, and treat wounded soldiers on both sides. Because look, in a just society, we treat wounded soldiers regardless of what side they're on. We would call that now the Geneva Conventions that most industrialized nations have signed on to. The reason why the United States has signed on to the Geneva Conventions is because of the work of Clara Barton. She would go to the front lines. Now look, there are a lot of brave people in this period, like I said, and many of them were soldiers, many of them are officers, and all that kind of stuff. But don't forget Harriet Tubman, and don't forget Clara Barton, because Clara Barton was on the front lines with those brave soldiers. And unlike those brave soldiers, she wasn't fighting back. She had no weapons. She was there trying to ignore the violence and tend to the wounded soldiers. She used corn husks as bandages at the Battle of Antietam. Remember, the bloodiest day in American history, because she ran out of supplies. After the war, she helped locate the bodies of family members that were killed in battle. There were so many unmarked graves, and families were like, where's my son? Where's my brother? Where's my dad? She helped give a proper burial to 40,000 men. She became a suffragette because she knew Susan B. Anthony was involved in the feminist movement. She became friends with Frederick Douglass and became an activist for the civil rights movement. She traveled to Europe, and when she came back from Europe, she founded the American Red Cross and became the first president of the American Red Cross. So just a towering figure, her and Tubman. And there's many more, but this is a survey class, and so we got to get going. So The last battle we're going to talk about, Gettysburg. It is the largest battle in the history of North America. It is the largest battle, obviously, of the Civil War, arguably the most important battle of the Civil War. And if it's the most important battle in the Civil War, then it is top 5 most important battles in the history of the United States, right? Yorktown, Saratoga, the Normandy invasion, Midway. But what was happening here? Robert E. Lee, again, remember, Robert E. Lee was basically the main general of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy, they can see the writing on the wall. And they think that in order for this to end successfully for them, they either need to get European support or get a negotiated, advantageous, agreement, compromise with the North. And they thought that both things could be accomplished, or either one of those things could be accomplished if they went into the North and scored a big victory, right? If they went into Northern Territory, scored a big victory, kind of like what they wanted to do at Antietam, but failed. They figure if we can go into Pennsylvania, get a big win, we can either convince European nations to come into the war on our side, and or maybe get the North to sit down and make some concessions. And so Lee has, basically, this is as good as Lee's army is going to get. They divert resources from the West. Again, remember, when Lee viewed this war selfishly, Lee viewed this war through the lens of his success. Grant viewed the war through the lens of Union success. And so Lee and Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, they diverted resources from the West. And so Lee had a 75,000-man army. This was as good as they're going to get. This was the peak of Lee's army. And what they didn't factor in, because this is a ridiculous plan, and we'll talk about how ridiculous it was and how terribly it goes for them, but George Meade now, it's not McClellan, it's not Burnside, it's not Hooker, it's George Meade that Lee is going to square off against. And is Meade great? No. He's average. But here's the thing. He goes by the book. He doesn't make mistakes. Lee's whole thing was pressure, 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 attack, 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 aggression, aggression, aggression. And, I'm going to try to not use a sports analogy, but by putting pressure on somebody, you force mistakes. Lee found it easy to force McClellan, Burnside, and Hooker into mistakes. George Meade, he's not going to make a mistake. Now, is he going to be brilliant? No. Is he going to, come up with some great thing that they still teach at West Point? No. But he was solid. And compared to previous generals that Lee squared off against, solid might as well be spectacular. The battle was never supposed to happen at Gettysburg. But, life is funny. And also keep in the back of your mind, Grant is on the verge of winning an enormous battle in the West at Vicksburg. But over here in the East, Gettysburg was supposed to be where the Confederates sort of met up and then sort of sprung out and attacked from there. However, they get reports that there's shoes in the town of Gettysburg. And they also get reports that there's not a big Union Army presence. Now, they were right about the shoes. They were wrong about the Union Army. And so one of Lee's generals says, if there's no objection, I'm going to take those shoes. And Lee said, yeah, go get those shoes. Because it's not just rifles and gunpowder. It is cold weather gear. It is food. It is water. It is shoes. And so they go into Gettysburg expecting little resistance, and they were just going to take the shoes and bada bing, bada boom. However, they ran into a pretty considerable Union army, not a giant army, but a lot more than they expected. And they're like, oh man, so they just thought it was going to be light skirmishing, but it turns into a scrap. And so Lee all of a sudden goes, oh, wow, okay. Lee commits all of his troops, more Union troops come, and the battle was never intended to be here, but those shoes. And so Gettysburg starts kind of by accident over shoes. And that first day, the Union lost. The Union sort of lost ground, had to consolidate their forces. The Confederacy caught them off guard and really pushed them back. Now, yes, the Union lost the day, but at the end of the day, the Union ends up holding really good defensible ground. They have the high ground. They have ground that's easier to defend. And so, a lot of people want the Civil War to make the Civil War out to be this grand chess match. And it's usually not. It's usually stuff like the first day of Gettysburg, which is like, what? Okay. But to the extent it is a grand chess match, it is before a battle starts. It is the night before a battle. And the night before a battle is when the generals get together and they kind of go over the maps and they're figuring out the next day's strategy. And Lee, look, he has one move. He attacks. That's all he knows how to do. He's very good at it, but that's all he knows how to do. And the Union had better ground, right? If you're going to defend, the type of ground you're defending really matters. And the Union had pretty good ground here to defend, and Meade knew what he was doing. And so Longstreet, James Longstreet, he was a friend of Grant at West Point, but he's a Southerner. He's fighting for the Confederacy. He is basically the right-hand man now of Lee. Longstreet goes, General Lee, this is folly. This is a ridiculous place to fight. Why fight them on ground of their choosing? Longstreet's idea was, let's head like we're going to Washington, D.C. By doing that, we'll force Meade's army to move. Once we get them to move, we can choose the ground upon which we fight rather than having them choose the ground. And Lee said, the enemy's there. We attack them there. The whole idea that Lee is this brilliant strategist, I'm sorry, but we have evidence. There's data. This was a ridiculous decision. It was a strategic blunder, maybe the biggest strategic blunder of the Civil War. And so once you decide that you are going to attack, the question then becomes how and where. And not to be overly reductive, but you can basically, attack the center, or you can attack one or both of the flank, or some combination of those three. And Lee decided to kind of make a head fake towards the middle, make Meade think that he was going to hit him right up the pipe, and then hit both flanks. And so we'll talk about the two flanks that Lee hit, and maybe the most important moment of that second day, maybe one of the most important moments in the entirety of the Civil War, given the gravity of Gettysburg, was Little Round Top. You can see it on the map there. Little Round Top is defended, among others, by the 20th Maine Regiment, and they're led by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, I never get to say this, the one time I get to say this, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was a college professor and a badass. He's like the patron saint of college professors, right? The only college professor you could say this about. He was a college professor who volunteered, became an officer, and is a badass, right? I light a candle. I light Saint Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain every night. I love Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And he's defending a little piece of ground called Little Round Top. And what makes this little piece of ground important is that it's high ground. And so the Confederacy is attacking uphill, and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is repelling Confederate attack after Confederate attack after Confederate attack, but he's running low on ammo. And if he loses Little Round Top, if the Confederacy get their hands on Little Round Top, they can put artillery at Little Round Top, they can pummel the Union positions from the high ground with their artillery. And this very well could have reshaped how Gettysburg ends up going. So this is critically important. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was a college professor and a badass, he understood this. And as he's running out of ammo and the Confederates are getting ready to make yet another charge, he ordered something that happened very infrequently on the Union side of things. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ordered his troops to fix bayonets and to charge. To fix bayonets, so if you can imagine a rifle, right? Now imagine a dagger on the end of that rifle, and so the rifle essentially becomes a spear. And the last thing you want to see in life is somebody charging at you with a spear, right? With a long piece of metal and wood with a dagger on the end of it. And this is the kind of thing the Confederacy did all the time, right? What's Lee's move? Attack. What's his move? Attack. The Union didn't do stuff like this often, but here they did. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain says, fix bayonets. So they put the bayonets on. He leads the charge himself. And the Confederates are like, what the hell? This is, all of a sudden you get a bunch of screaming Union soldiers flying down the hill at them with spears, right? With rifles with bayonets. And he annihilates the Confederates. He saved Little Round Top. The Confederates are unable to get their artillery on Little Round Top, and he saves the day. Who saves the day? A college professor. He's not only a college professor, but what else is he? A badass. Hold on, give me a second. I'm going to go light my St. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain candle. So the left flank holds, the right flank holds too. This is another crazy story. The 1st Minnesota on a place called Cemetery Hill. Again, it's on, you can check it out on the map. 262 troops, Union troops, are holding off an attack by almost 3,000 Confederates. And they have to hold. They have to hold the line. They know reinforcements are coming. And rather than just let the onslaught happen, they decide to attack the Confederates. 262 guys decide to attack 2,600 Confederates. They had an 82% casualty rate, the highest in the Civil War. And if it's the highest in the Civil War, it's one of the highest in American history. And you know what? They saved the day. They held. Reinforcements arrived. Both flanks hold. The second day is a Confederate failure and a Union victory. The third day. Now, look, there doesn't have to be a third day. So the night of the second day, the same conversation on the Confederate lines happened. Longstreet goes, look, we tried. Let's fight them somewhere else. Let's leave this ground. Let's make them think we're going somewhere else. Let's make them move their feet. Let's make them fight on ground that we choose, not fight on ground that they choose. And I'll give you one guess as to what Lee said. You know what he said. He said, the enemy's there, we're going to attack them there. Strategic genius. Now, let's put yourself in the shoes of George Meade. Lee has tried both of your flanks. If you are sitting with your generals that second night and trying to anticipate where Lee's going to hit, where do you think he's going to hit? If he's hit your left flank and your right flank, what do you think? If you're guessing in the middle, you're right. Congratulations. You have a better strategic mind than Robert E. Lee. You figured out the mystery of Robert E. Lee. He hit the left flank, he hit the right flank. The third day, he's going to go right up the gut. A full frontal assault by 14,000 men is called Pickett's Charge. It is one of the bloodiest, foolhardy charges in history. Remember, we talked about this. 14,000 men march out of the tree line towards entrenched Union positions. Why? Most of those 14,000 men don't own slaves. I'll go a step farther. Not only do most of them not own slaves, I would argue that most of those 14,000 men would actually benefit from a culture without slavery. You don't think those 14,000 men would benefit from cheap college? You don't think those 14,000 men would benefit from the Homestead Act? The presence of slavery had a repressive effect on the vast majority of whites in the South. However, they didn't see the world through the lens of class, did they? They saw the world through the lens of race. They marched to their death to protect a way of life that they thought was made possible by slavery. They marched to their death to fight and die for an institution that not only didn't benefit them, you can make a pretty compelling argument, actually hurt them. And yet here we are. 15,000 men in Pickett's charge the Union lines and are cut to pieces. The Confederacy suffered a 50% casualty rate that day. 50% casualty rate. The Union repelled the attack. The line was almost breached, but it wasn't. And what people say about that, where the Confederacy got to on that line was, quote, the high water mark of the Confederacy. That's the farthest the Confederacy ever reached into Union territory. And they were repelled. And that, look, I don't want to get overly simplistic, but this is a survey class, and this is the last battle we talk about. Really, at the end of the day, with the victory, the massive victory by Meade over Lee at Gettysburg, and then the next day, Grant securing a victory at Vicksburg in the West, it's overly simplistic to say after Gettysburg, it was a matter of when, not if, but it's awfully close to being true. The ramifications are over 50,000 American casualties, the largest battle ever fought in North America. The Confederates would never again threaten Union soil. Whatever aura of Lee's invulnerability was left, that was gone. Any chance of European recognition, gone. It raised Union morale through the roof. The one mistake Meade made at the Battle of Gettysburg was when the battle was won and Lee marched home. He didn't chase Lee down and destroy his army. If that was Grant or Sherman or Sheridan or Thomas, they would have done it, and the war would have ended probably right there. But Meade won the most important battle of the Civil War. Now we're picking nits, right? A few months after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln goes to the battlefield and gives a speech, and it becomes one of the greatest speeches, one of the most memorable speeches in the history of our country. He says, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as the final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we can't dedicate, we can't consecrate, we can't hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln, Grant, the Union, we fought for the idea the government of, for, and by the people shall not perish from the earth. What did the Confederacy fight for? Not longer after the victory at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Lincoln makes one last change, the best change. He names U.S. Grant the commanding general of the Army, the first person to have that distinction since Washington, and Grant then names Sherman the leader of the Western Army. And so it took Lincoln a while, but he's finally shuffled the deck where the two aces are where they should be. I put some quotes there of Grant. I think it really tells you a lot about the guy. We don't need to go through all of them. I already told you that quote about Lee. What do you think, is going to do a double somersault and be in our on our rear and our flanks at the same time? Come on, you guys figure it out. I also love the one, I don't underrate the value of military knowledge, but if men make war in slavish obedience to rules, they will fail. He was a straight-talking, simple guy. The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is. Get at him as soon as you can, strike as hard as you can, and keep moving. I love this one. If in every battle there comes a time when both sides consider themselves beaten, then he who continues the attack wins. That last one, so after the war, he becomes the most famous, most revered, most respected, most honored American after Lincoln's assassination. And so he would always, everybody would ask him to be at, this function and that function, and they'd always ask him to stand up and say a few words. And he was fond of saying this quote, well, not a quote, but he was fond of saying this. He said, "I rise only to say that I do not intend to say anything. Thank you for your hearty welcomes and good cheers." And then he would just sit down. So Tecumseh Sherman's in charge of the West. Grant is in charge of the East. And Grant understands what no general before him did, which is this is not about Richmond. This is not about a piece of land. It's about Lee. And so Grant, who saw the whole chessboard, uses all the resources, uses all of his generals, and coordinates the West and the East and everywhere to go after Lee. It is truly the first modern kind of synchronized war plan. And Tecumseh Sherman goes to Grant and Lincoln and says, "Hey, I have an idea. I want to take my army and march through the South and basically get to, march to the South and be like a NASCAR driver and march to the South and then turn left. I'm going to march to the sea and then turn left, and then I'll meet up with Grant and the war will be over." And Lincoln and Grant said, "Aren't you worried about your supply lines?" And Sherman said, I don't need no damn supply lines. I will take anything I need, and whatever I don't need, I'm going to destroy. Not to belabor this point, but this is a very modern way of thinking militarily. Like the South decided to secede, and remember, Sherman's mind was really shaped by Shiloh, and basically Sherman says, if you want war, I'm going to give it to you. And he says, if you can whip Lee and I can march to the Atlantic, I think Uncle Abe will give us 20 days leave of absence to see the young folks. I'm so sick and tired of war, he said. Its glory is all moonshine. You will find this. The people that romanticize war, that want war, that like to, they are not the ones that have seen it. If you've seen war, if you've seen combat, you don't ever want to see it again. Because he says, even success, the most brilliant, is over dead and mangled bodies. It is only those who have never heard a shot, nor heard the shrills and groans of the wounded and lacerated friend or foe, that cry aloud for more blood and more vengeance and more desolation. Talking about sort of his belief in all-out war, he said, if the people raise a howl against my barbarity and cruelty, I will answer that war is war. It's not popularity seeking. If they want peace, they and their relatives must stop the war. You can't qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And those who brought the war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions that a people can pour out. In other words, you want this? All right, I'm going to give it to you. And he marches through the South like something out of the book of Revelations, like a hot knife through butter, leaving a wake of destruction in his path. And to this day, the South hates Sherman with the heat of 1,000 suns. Sherman takes Atlanta. Lincoln wins re-election. Grant is hounding Lee. Lee's army is starving. Lee's army is deserting. Grant is bullying Lee. He's having his way with Lee. And Lee, how many people died when everybody knew this war was over, and yet Lee was too proud to surrender? Now, as Sherman is cutting through the South and Grant is destroying Lee's army, Lincoln does something amazing, which is twist every arm, do whatever he had to do to get Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. Because like I said, remember, with the conservative pro-slavery Supreme Court, there was every possibility that with the war ends, the Supreme Court that ruled about Dred Scott would rule the Emancipation Proclamation unconstitutional. And so Lincoln, God bless him, got this amendment passed so we didn't ever have to face that horrible potentiality. The 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. I bolded the except as a punishment for a crime because that clause, if you can go back in time and argue that they should not put that clause in there, because the South and arguably still modern America gets around involuntary servitude by that carve-out, which except as a punishment for a crime. But slavery's over. The first slaves arrived in North America in 1619, and it's 1865 that slavery is finally prohibited in America. Lee and Grant meet on April 9th to discuss the terms of surrender. And the scene could not be more exemplary of what we're dealing with here. Lee represents aristocracy. Grant represents meritocracy. Lee was there in his fine dress uniform with his sash and his sword. Grant, who always looked like hell, had just been riding over land. His boots were muddy. His uniform is dirty. Grant has a Native American on his staff that's actually going to write out the terms of surrender. This really is aristocracy versus meritocracy, the old versus the new, ethnicity and race versus meritocracy and values. The Native American on Grant's staff, his name was Eli Parker, or General Parker, if you prefer, and his presence in the room disoriented Lee. Again, the contrast was so stark, right? Birthright privilege in Lee and meritocracy in Grant and Parker. And Lee says of Parker in the room, he goes, well, at least there's one real American here. And Parker says, we're all Americans. here. As Lee is reading the terms of surrender that Grant is offering, Grant takes a cigar, lights it, and puffs it. He smoked 15 to 20 a day. The terms of surrender that Grant proposes and Lee accepts are beyond generous. Basically, the Confederate soldiers are immediately pardoned. They can keep their sidearms and their swords. They can keep their livestock. They just have to hand in their rifles. That's it. And then they can go home. Grant and Lincoln could not have been more generous, more lenient than this. They went out of their way because what they wanted was the nation to heal, for the nation's wounds to mend. They did not want hostilities to continue. Now, we'll discuss next time whether or not this was a good idea. I mean, the idea from Grant and Lincoln and being so generous and so lenient in their terms of surrender was that this would help the nation heal and would help the South operate in good faith with the end of slavery. We'll talk about how this didn't work, and maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Grant and Lincoln were too kind, too generous, too magnanimous, too selfless. We'll talk about that next time. Grant then asks Lee, because, this isn't the end of the war, technically. This is Grant accepting Lee's surrender. And what Grant says to Lee is, look, you need to speak to your other commanders and get them to surrender too. To which Lee responds, I'll have to ask my president. And what he meant was Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. After Lee says, I have to ask my president, Grant pauses, draws from his cigar, exhales, and says, there's only one president now. And it's over. It's over. My God, it's over. The bloodiest war in American history, the war that there are more Americans that die in this war than every other American war combined. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 620 to 850,000. The number you hear most often is 750,000. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million casualties. In southern states, they would spend 20% of their state budgets on artificial limbs. The South lost a fifth to a third of their military-age population. The Southern wealth was halved. They lost $4 billion in investments. Northern wealth, on the other hand, doubled because the North was able to pass legislation that Southern Democrats had been preventing. Now they could pass it, and so the Northern economy was booming. And so the war is over. The South secedes from the Union to defend the institution of slavery and defend a racial hierarchy and white supremacy. The North beats them down and gets them to surrender, and the war is over. And now you have to figure out how on earth do you get these 11 states that had seceded, that had committed treason against the United States of America? How do you bring them back into the Union? How do you get them back into the fold? How do you mend the wounds of a nation? And now there are 4 million human beings that had previously been slaves that are no longer slaves. What is the government's responsibility to freedmen? They're called freedmen. There is a lot of work left to do. Now, good Lord, the Civil War was as brutal of an affair as you can come up with, and it was as difficult as an affair as there's ever been. However, what comes next, Reconstruction, is incredibly complicated and difficult too. But we'll talk about that next time. And until next time, I'm History.